My beloved sons and daughters, today we do not gather for a lecture, nor assemble for mere encouragement. No, we stand at the threshold of divine revelation, for I have not come with words polished for applause, but with fire sealed in the truth of heaven. In a world shaking with uncertainty, we must ask, where does power truly rest? Is it in what we hold, what we see, what we feel? Nay, the power is not in your possession. The power is not in your plans. The power is in the promise, and not a human promise, a divine one, not ink on contracts that tear, but a covenant sealed by the breath of the eternal. What has been spoken over your life is not wishful thinking. It is a word alive with authority, waiting for your faith to unlock it. The heavens do not move by noise, they move by promise, and today we will journey into that holy place where divine words carry divine weight. The promise is a covenant, not a contract, my beloved. We must first understand the difference between what man builds and what God ordains. In the affairs of men, promises are written in ink that fades, on paper that burns, bound by terms that shift like the sand. These are contracts, temporary, conditional, fragile. A contract is only as strong as the one who signs it, and as lasting as the mutual benefit allows. Break the terms, and the contract is void. One party fails, and the bond dissolves. That is the way of man. That is the economy of earth. But a covenant, O children of light, a covenant is not bound by condition. It is sealed by consecration. It is not written in ink, but in blood. It is not drafted by lawyers, but declared by the voice of the Eternal. When God makes a promise, He does not consult your record, your past, or your resume. He speaks from the well of His own faithfulness. For He cannot lie, He cannot fail, and He cannot break what He has spoken. The promise that God gives is not a document. It is a declaration. It is not something we negotiate. It is something we receive. And once spoken, it does not depend on the winds of your emotions, the seasons of your life, or the opinions of men. It rests on the unshakable nature of God's character. The promise is not a deal, it is a decree. When God made covenant with Abraham, He did not shake his hand, He put him to sleep. And while Abraham lay in the stillness of surrender, God walked through the pieces of the sacrifice by Himself. Why? Because the fulfillment of the promise would not rest on Abraham's ability, but on God's integrity. This is what makes the promise unbreakable, not because we are faithful, but because He is. So many lose heart because they measure divine promises with human standards. They think if they fail, the promise fails. But beloved, your weakness does not revoke the word of God. Your stumbles do not cancel the covenant, for He has sworn by Himself, and there is none higher to appeal to. That which He has promised, He will perform. This is why the promise gives peace, not because the journey is easy, but because the covenant is eternal. Even when the world is shaking, the promise remains. Even when friends walk away, the promise stands, because it is not built on sand. It is rooted in the rock of divine faithfulness. The prophets did not stand on contracts. The saints of old did not walk through fire and flood, clinging to agreements signed in earthly courts. No, they moved forward holding the covenant spoken by the mouth of God. They understood that what He begins, He finishes. What He says, He seals. What He promises, He performs. This is why your faith must not be in what you see, but in what He has said. Because there will be times when nothing around you looks like the promise. There will be days when the ground is dry, the sky is silent, and your hands are empty. But remember, the covenant is not made with your comfort. It is made with your destiny. The promise remains because God remains, and in that we find rest, not in circumstances, not in timing, but in the unshifting, unchanging, unwavering covenant of the Lord. The promise carries the authority of the one who spoke it. Hear me now. sons and daughters of the kingdom. The value of a promise is never in the paper, it is in the person. The weight of a word is carried by the one who speaks it. And when that speaker is the Alpha and the Omega, the Ancient of Days, the Creator of all things visible and invisible, then that word is not suggestion, it is command. It is not opinion, it is order. It is not a hopeful wish, it is an eternal truth waiting to manifest. When the Lord speaks a promise over your life, that word is not floating in the air, uncertain and weak. It is charged with the full authority of heaven. It moves with divine backing. It is enforced by angels, confirmed by the Spirit, and rooted in the unshakable throne of God. The enemy does not fear your personality, but he trembles at the promise over your life. Because every promise that God gives is a threat to the kingdom of darkness. The promise is a proclamation of victory before the battle begins. It is the announcement of light before darkness is scattered. And it carries with it the very breath of God life, giving, world-shaping destiny, defining. Remember when Jesus spoke to the storm, he did not argue with it. He did not negotiate. He said, "Peace, be still." And creation obeyed. Why? Because the words that proceeded from his mouth were not mere expressions, they were extensions of his dominion. That same authority rests upon the promises he has made to you. If he has said you are more than a conqueror, then you are, even when you feel defeated. If he has said, "No weapon formed against you shall prosper," then no matter what rises, it shall fall. If he has said he will supply all your needs, then famine and fear cannot disqualify the provision. You must stop measuring the promise by your current reality. Measure it by the one who declared it. Has he ever failed? Has his word ever returned void? Has he ever spoken and not brought it to pass? No, for he watches over his word, not casually but jealously. He guards it, he sends it forth, he ensures its completion. The promise does not tremble in the face of trial. The promise does not bow to the calendar of man. The promise does not submit to the threats of the enemy. Why? Because it carries the badge of divine sovereignty. Do not insult the promise by wrapping it in your doubts. Do not shrink it to fit the limitations of your logic. The promise is greater than you. It is larger than your lineage. It is mightier than your fears, because it came from a mouth that shaped the cosmos and formed man from dust. So when he speaks, stand. When he promises, believe, not because it makes sense, not because it's easy, but because it is spoken by the one whose words hold galaxies together and whose whisper can silence the armies of hell. The power of the promise is not in your belief, but your belief will unlock its power. The weight of the promise is not in your striving, but your surrender makes room for its fulfillment. So trust not in yourself, but in the one who spoke. His voice does not echo in vain. His word does not fall to the ground. When he says it, it is so whether you see it yet or not. Faith is the bridge between the promise and its power. There are many who have heard the promise, but never seen its power. They have read the words, sung the songs, recited the verses, and yet they walk without the evidence of what has been spoken. Not because the promise was weak, not because heaven forgot, but because the bridge between the word and the wonder was never crossed. That bridge, beloved, is faith. Faith is not a feeling. Faith is not inspiration. Faith is not the absence of doubt. It is the decision to walk in obedience despite doubt. It is the unseen hand that reaches into eternity and pulls the invisible into visibility. Without faith, the promise remains dormant, not dead, but waiting for someone bold enough to believe. It is not enough to know what God has said. One must respond to what he has said. Faith is the response. Faith says yes when everything around you says no. Faith says now when the world says never. Faith believes not because it sees, but because it trusts the character of the one who spoke. In the sacred pages of old, we see it again and again, faith turning promises into power. By faith the walls of Jericho fell. By faith the barren conceived. By faith the sea split and the dead were raised. The promise alone did not shake the earth. Faith brought it to life. You see, the promise is like a well of living water. Deep, abundant, eternal, but faith is the bucket that draws it up. Without faith, the water remains untouched. The well is full, but the cup is empty. The promise is available, but the life remains dry. There are those who say, if God promised it, why haven't I seen it? The question is not whether the promise was spoken. The question is whether it was believed. For the power of the promise is released not by mere proximity, but by faith. You can be in the house of promise and still live like a stranger if you do not believe. Faith does not require understanding. It requires surrender. Faith does not wait for evidence. It becomes the evidence. Faith is not passive. It is aggressive in the spirit. It speaks, it moves, it acts in alignment with what heaven has declared, even when the ground is shaking beneath your feet. The centurion said, "Only speak the word, and my servant shall be healed." That is faith. Not waiting for signs, but trusting the voice, not needing proof, but resting in authority. And Jesus said, "I have not seen such great faith." Why? Because the man understood the link between the promise and its power. Faith stands in the gap between what is and what shall be. It is the posture of the heart that says, "God, I believe you above my senses. I believe you above my situation. I believe you above what I see." And in that belief, the heavens begin to move. Without faith, the promise remains a seed that never sprouts. But with faith, the smallest word from God can shake kingdoms. Faith does not ask how. It simply says yes. Faith does not demand answers. It declares allegiance. The woman with the issue of blood had no guarantee in the natural, no confirmation, no letter, but she had a promise in her spirit, and faith pushed her through the crowd. Faith reached for the hem. Faith said, "If I just touch." And in that moment, power met promise, because faith bridged the gap. The promise can wait years, even decades, but when faith rises, delay is broken, power is released, chains are shattered, doors open. Not because God changed, but because someone believed again. Let it be known, the promises of God are not museum pieces to be admired. They are weapons of war to be wielded by faith. When you speak the promise in faith, the atmosphere shifts. When you walk in the promise by faith, strongholds fall. There is power waiting to manifest in your life. Not new power, not potential power, but promised power, and it is waiting on your faith to rise. Not perfect faith, not loud faith, just surrendered faith, the kind that says, "Nevertheless, at your word." That's all it takes for the promise to move from heaven's scroll into earth's soil. Delays are not denials. They are divine preparations. The human heart grows restless when time stretches long. We pray, we fast, we cry, and still the heavens seem silent. Days become months, and months become years. And the whisper of the enemy grows louder. It's not going to happen. You were mistaken. The promise has passed. But hear the voice of truth. Delay is not denial. God is not in a hurry. He is not rushed by our clocks or pressured by our deadlines. He moves in appointed times, not convenient ones. And when there is a delay between the promise and its fulfillment, it is not to torture you. It is to prepare you. What the promise will require of you, you may not be ready to carry today. The delay is not a punishment. It is a process, a refining fire, a shaping season. The Lord delays not because he forgot, but because He is forming something deeper than your request. He is forming the strength to sustain what He is about to release. The people of Israel were promised a land flowing with milk and honey, but before they entered, they wandered, not because God changed His mind, but because the people needed to be transformed before they could inhabit the land. A free people could not carry a slave mindset, and so the desert became the training ground. The wilderness became the classroom of trust. In delay, God teaches you to lean. In delay, He purifies your motives. In delay, He reveals your idols and sharpens your discernment. He shows you that He is enough, even when the promise is yet to come. The delay is often the place where true worship is born. Because when you worship without answers, when you praise without fulfillment, when you serve while still waiting, that is worship not for the gifts, but for the giver. Delay exposes what we trust. It shows whether we trust the timing more than the one who holds time. Many forfeit the promise not because God said no, but because they walked away during the wait. They grew weary. They settled for what was available instead of what was appointed. But those who wait upon the Lord, those who wait with worship, with wonder, with unwavering trust, they renew their strength, they mount up, they rise, because in the waiting they are not being diminished, they are being developed. The seed cannot break the ground before its time. It must sit in the dark. It must endure the pressure, but in due season it will break forth. The darkness is not its death. It is its preparation. So too with the promise. The delay is the soil, the silence is the covering, the struggle is the water, and when the time is right, when heaven sees that you are ready and the earth is ready, what was spoken will break forth like the dawn. God does not tease with promises. He does not dangle hope like a carrot before a horse. What He says He intends, but what He intends He also prepares. And sometimes the longer the delay, the greater the glory. The promise is not fading in the delay. It is deepening. It is taking root. It is stretching beneath the surface so that when it finally appears, it cannot be shaken. For what grows too fast breaks too soon. But what is forged in delay endures. Every promise is backed by eternal integrity. There is no word more secure than the word of the one who cannot lie. Every syllable that escapes the mouth of God is soaked in His nature, holy, unchanging, eternal. When He speaks, He does not speak out of impulse or emotion. He does not retract what He declares. He does not exaggerate or minimize. He speaks from a place of total knowing, total sovereignty, and total purity. His promise is not a mere intention. It is a reflection of His being. That is why every promise He gives is backed by eternal integrity. When a king in the natural world makes a decree, it must be carried out. But kings die, kingdoms fall, and thrones are overthrown. Not so with the King of glory. His throne is everlasting. His reign is without end. His decrees are not open to revision, and His word does not age or erode. The promise that was true in the desert remains true in the city. The promise that was spoken to Abraham still breathes today. It is not limited by time or diluted by repetition. It carries the full weight of eternity. He does not promise based on your worthiness, but on His character. You may falter, you may question, you may weep and wander, but He remains. The constancy of His integrity is the foundation under every divine word. He has nothing to gain by promising and everything to lose if He fails. But failure is not in His nature. He cannot be false, for truth is not just something He speaks. It is something He is. Men may use words to manipulate. Men may make promises to gain favor, to ease guilt, to buy time, but God is not man. He has no need to persuade or deceive. When He promises, it is pure, without shadow, without agenda. It is a guarantee grounded in His holiness. The covenant He made with Noah still holds. The word He gave to David still stands. The promise of salvation through Christ is just as powerful today as it was at Calvary, not because people have been faithful, but because God has been. The world shifts, culture evolves, leaders rise and fall, but His word, His promise remains unshaken. When He says He will deliver, He has already seen the escape route. When He says He will provide, the provision is already in motion. When He says He will heal, healing begins even in the silence. His integrity does not wait for applause or agreement. It is the immovable center of all that He does. You must never judge the strength of the promise by your own ability to understand it. His thoughts are higher, His ways are deeper, and His promises are far more durable than the doubts that dance in your mind. The promise will endure your questions. It will survive your fears, because it is anchored in the eternal nature of a God who has never broken His word. The angels do not tremble at our plans. The demons do not flee at our declarations. But all of heaven and all of hell recognize the authority of the one who speaks with perfect integrity. His promises carry weight in both the visible and invisible realms. When He speaks a word, it echoes through generations. Even the stars obey because of that voice. The seas know their boundary because of that command. And your life, too, is being held together by the integrity of a promise spoken before you were formed. That promise is not fragile. It is not subject to decay. It is held in the vault of heaven, preserved by the very breath of God. When you walk through the fire and remember the promise, you are not clinging to a wish. You are standing on the integrity of the Almighty, and though the flames rise, the word will not burn. Though the winds howl, the word will not break, because every promise God gives is wrapped in His eternal character, and His character does not change. The promise will outlast the storm. Storms are inevitable. They rise without warning, they roar without mercy, and they test everything not built on the rock. Storms come in many forms: crisis, betrayal, sickness, loss, isolation. They shake foundations, they flood the soul, and when the storm comes, it does not ask permission. It does not wait for your convenience. It crashes in. It tries to undo what you've built. It tries to drown what you've believed. But even in the storm, the promise stands. It may be obscured by the rain. It may be silenced by the wind, but it remains untouched, unchanged. The promise was not made in calm, whether just to be canceled in the tempest. It was spoken with the storm in mind. It was declared knowing that trials would come. The promise is not weak. It does not retreat. It does not crumble. It outlasts. When the disciples were on the boat and the waves rose high, they panicked. But Jesus had already said, "Let us go to the other side." That was the promise, and no matter how high the water climbed, the promise was still greater. The storm had no power to cancel what had already been spoken. But they forgot, they feared, they doubted the word in the face of the wind, yet the word had not changed. This is how it is for many. God has spoken something over your life, but the storm has made you question it. The lightning has made you forget the light, but the promise does not bow to weather. The word of God is stormproof. It is made to survive the shaking. It is designed to anchor you when nothing else will. A storm reveals the strength of what you're holding. If your foundation is built on feelings, the storm will expose it. If your trust is built on circumstances, the storm will overturn it. But if your faith is rooted in the promise, then the winds may rage, but you will remain. The promise was spoken before the storm began, and the promise will still be true after the storm ends, because the storm is seasonal, but the word is eternal. The enemy sends storms to distract you from the voice, but heaven allows storms to drive you deeper into the voice. When Paul was shipwrecked on Malta, he had already received a word. You must stand before Caesar. That was the promise, and though the ship broke apart, the word did not. The boat sank, but the mission lived, because the promise outlives the storm. Not even the sea could swallow what God had spoken. The storm may steal your sleep, but it cannot steal your destiny. It may shake your plans, but it cannot shake the promise. For the Lord who speaks is not intimidated by thunder. He walks on waves. He commands the storm to be still. And even when he does not stop it immediately, he will carry you through it because he is faithful to what he has said. There will be moments when you cannot see the shore, when the sky is dark, and when every voice in your head says it's over. But remember the voice that spoke before the storm. Recall the word. Hold to it like a lifeline. Speak it back into the atmosphere. Declare it until fear breaks. The storm cannot cancel what heaven has written, and as you endure, you will begin to see that the promise is not fragile. It is forged for the fire. It is not lightweight. It is heavy with divine intent, and while the storm was sent to break you, the promise was sent to build you. One howls for your defeat, the other declares your victory, and only one will remain. The storm will pass, the sky will clear, but the word of the Lord endures forever. The promise makes the weak strong. The promise was never made for the perfect, but for the weary, the broken, the trembling hands and heavy hearts. It reaches for the one who has no strength left and whispers, "You are not alone." When God gives a promise, he also gives the grace to endure until it comes to pass. It is not your strength that upholds the word. It is the word that upholds you. The promise becomes your strength in the valley, your breath when you feel suffocated, your song in the silence. Gideon was hiding in weakness when the word called him mighty man. Sarah laughed in her frailty before becoming the mother of nations. The promise does not deny weakness. It invades it, and in that invasion something shifts. Not because you are strong, but because the one who promised is. His promise begins to whisper louder than your fear, and where you once wavered, you now walk with authority. Not your own, but the strength borrowed from what was spoken. Faith activates the power of the promise. The promise alone carries weight, but faith unlocks its release. It is not enough to hear it. You must believe it. Faith takes the invisible word and births visible results. Without faith, the promise remains in potential. With faith, it becomes power in motion. Faith does not wait for conditions to be perfect. It steps out while the storm still rages. It is the touch that drew power from the hem, the voice that cried out for sight, the step that walked on water. God speaks the promise, but faith responds with obedience. It doesn't demand full clarity. It trusts the character of the promiser. Faith activates what was lying dormant. It stirs the soil, it moves the mountain, it aligns the earth with heaven's decree. The promise is a loaded weapon. Faith pulls the trigger. The promise is the seed. Faith waters it. And when faith rises, what was once impossible becomes inevitable. You are sustained by the word, not by the world. The world shifts like sand, its systems fail. Its voices confuse, its rewards fade. But the word of the Lord remains fixed, sure, unshaken. When everything around you collapses, the word still holds. You are not kept by trends, not carried by applause, not upheld by human affirmation. You are sustained by what was spoken before you were formed. The same word that framed the heavens frames your future. Manna fell not from markets, but from the mouth of God. Elijah was fed not by favor, but by a word. You breathe because he said live. You stand because he said rise. The world may strip you bare, but the word clothes you in purpose, shields you in truth, and feeds you with life. What he speaks is not seasonal. It's sustaining. You don't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from his mouth. The fulfillment of the promise reveals the glory of God. when the promise comes to pass, it doesn't merely confirm your faith, it magnifies His faithfulness. The promise fulfilled is not just an answered prayer, it is a revelation of who He is. Every breakthrough, every healing, every door opened, every storm silenced is a reflection of His glory shining through your life. The fulfillment draws eyes not to your strength, but to His sovereignty. It causes others to say, "Only God could have done this." He fulfills His word not to elevate you, but to exalt Himself through you. When barren wombs birth nations and dry bones stand up and live, it's not human effort that is praised, but divine power made visible. The fulfillment of the promise is heaven touching earth, eternity interrupting time, and God proving Himself faithful. Now, as we reach the altar of this message, let us behold what has been laid before us. We began with the truth that the promise is a covenant, not a contract, sealed not in ink but in divine blood. Then we saw that the promise carries the authority of the one who spoke it, the very breath that formed galaxies. But without faith, even the holiest promise lies dormant, for faith is the bridge between the promise and its power. And though the vision may tarry, be not discouraged, for delays are not denials. They are divine preparations shaping you to carry the weight of fulfillment. We learned that every promise is backed by eternal integrity, not by your performance, but by His perfection. And in the fiercest storm, remember, the promise will outlast the storm, standing while the winds rage and the waves roar. Even in your frailty, the promise does not fade, for the promise makes the weak strong, clothing the weary in heavenly might. And when you dare to believe, truly believe, then faith activates the power of the promise, pulling from heaven what eyes have not yet seen. You are not fed by man's economy, but by a higher source, for you are sustained by the Word, not by the world. And when the promise blossoms into fulfillment, it is not your greatness that shines. It is His, for the fulfillment of the promise reveals the glory of God. This is not mere inspiration. This is impartation. This is not just a word to be heard. It is a sword to be wielded. The promise is your power. The word is your weapon. The covenant is your covering. So walk boldly, not in your name, but in His word. Speak faithfully, not from your strength, but from His promise, for everything He has declared still stands.